Uh, this is Dr. Bonnie Wozolek joining you here with Dr. Reagan Patrick Mitchell, independent scholar, to think today about curriculum theorizing with us. And so, Dr. Mitchell, could you please tell me very briefly, how would you define curriculum studies?
Um, I think I always approach, and once again, I always want to make sure that um, this is not some miraculous thought that I just came to. Um, this for me is, first of all, understanding and making sure I acknowledge that this field is built on the shoulders of so many OGs, right? Um, but in thinking about like how I define curriculum studies, um, for me, it's more so, first of all, it is so much of what people don't think of or don't or so opposite of how people talk about curriculum, right? So it's not necessarily it's not these lesson plans, it's not any of that. It's really this whole point of sort of asking the broader, a deeper inquiry. Once again, I say inquiry, not questions, right? You answer a question, you live with an inquiry. So once again, thinking about curriculum studies, I think at the core of it, it's always inquiry, but also this whole point of sort of also thinking about like what does it mean to think about this idea of learning and knowledge development and communal knowledge development along local, national, global, and international lines that once again exist and decentralizes the brick and mortar, very classical sense of the institution, right? So for me, when we talk about curriculum studies, we're not solely, we're not, um, we're not centralizing the brick and mortar institution. More than anything, we're thinking about what does it mean to think about communal knowledges, right? And once again, when I say communal knowledges, that's not flat either. When I talk about communal knowledge, I'm talking about this sense of knowledge that is cultivated within the home, that is cultivated, and once again, the in-between spaces, the interstitial relationship with knowledge that sits very much beyond. It sits not only um, decentralizes the brick and mortar institution, but in many ways has us think about like what are these ways of being, knowing, and doing that give us this whole other way of what it is to think about learning and and knowledge development on these different scales. So for me, that's what curriculum studies is, right? It's really challenging. And, in many ways, it's these ways of how we talk about knowledge development that critique what we think about the um, the brick and mortar institution, and also think about in many ways, how perhaps how the flavor of the institution, the classical brick and mortar institution, is problematic, and then also in many ways how it can also be informed, right? So when I talk about curriculum studies, I think of it very much think of it very much as to always shout out Michelle Wright. It's a very much an epiphenomenal engagement, right? And once again, Michelle Wright, she says so beautiful, the past, present, and future is all as realized as the always as is now, right? So that's the other part. Curriculum studies is always for me, and it's necessary for it to be an aspirational project, right? A project of radical dreaming as a way of rethinking and thinking about the possibilities of what equity creation means, and especially not in the context of and thinking about that diasporically, thinking about that historically, thinking about that ancestrally, but also thinking about like that how that once again is also simultaneously a futuristic, surrealistic engagement as well. So there's
Right.
my definition.
Thank you. And can you talk very briefly about your contributions to the field?
Oh man. You know, Dr. Wozolek, as you know, that's a very challenging thing for me to that struggles with, I struggle with that. I also want to say like as somebody that is like a profound admirer of you and your work, um, that that's a hard one. I will say like perhaps, I think some of my what my contributions might be once again is in a way of um emboldening 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 the ways in which we sort of which sort of we talk about sonic context, how we talk about the possibility of how we think about sound, and overall sort of how our sensoriums inform, right? So it's a lot of my research is around thinking about what does it mean to talk about our first of all understanding ourselves, our bodies, is not necessarily a something that is socialized to think that we have five senses, but there's really this whole point to talk about sensorium in a way to sort of melt those sort of social binaries of how we think about how we sense an environment, right? So that, and that's where perhaps where the sonic is for me, right? That, and really thinking about not only understanding the sonic as a or challenging the idea of how we think about the sonic engagement as not solely and only and majorly being a cochlear engagement, you know? So there's that, but there's also some of the work, of course, I work in is also rooted in thinking about Black diaspora work, right? Very much thinking about the possibility of what does it mean to talk about Black surrealism, right? And really think about that Black surrealism as very much once again the curricular project, right? The project of doing the very much the lived experience, but also the constant living project, right? And think about the presence of what it means to sort of process and engage with these very ancient ways of Black knowledge doing, but also understanding them as a very present thing, right? I always talk about, and this once again, this does come from very much a love of self, because for me, I think that I really do profoundly believe that we have something that we all do really beautifully and better than anybody else in the world, right? Now, I'm in no way saying that I do any of this better than anybody else in the world, but I will say that perhaps one of my ways of sort of thinking about and processing the contribution has been one of being really honest with myself, right? And being like really thinking about these things, like what really like turns me on, what really gets me, what really like excites me. And I'm gonna say like unapologetically, it is Blackness and queerness, right? And so very much think it's from these standpoints where I think about like how we think about what it is to think about Black queer knowledge doing, right? And the research. And so doing that research as well, um, very much thinking about like what happens when we are able to what does it mean when we sort of think about very much this sense of like how we talk about ancestors, right? Because I often talk about the thinking about ancestral communing and everything. Why? Because I think that's very much, if we talk about sort of from a curriculum studies standpoint, it's something in which um it's been very much a lived experience for me, but also this whole idea, it really helps also begin to think about this idea of how distance narratives gets constructed, right? Because once again, in many ways, I've also heard people talk about this idea of ancestry, the ancestors is something that's far off and untouchable rather than something. There are people who live with us and commune with us in many ways, which gets me into very much a way of talking about but thinking about like why we talk about sensorium, right? Because if anything, I think what it always reveals to me in the conversation, I always realizes when I raise this to people, when I say, or do we have five senses, or are we socially constructed to think we have five senses, right? In many ways, when for me, when thinking about the contribution, what it does is really in many ways sort of uh has me engage in my scholarship in ways of sort of asking different or posing different sort of inquiries, like what does it mean if we begin to sort of conceptualize and really sort of play and push against sort of these binaries that have been socially constructed in our sensorium, And what does that say in many ways of once again how we feel, but also looking at very much a history of ethnicities and cultures and nations that very much have these histories of once again what it means to think, and once again talk about an ancestral thing is very much a present and a futuristic standpoint as well, right? So in many ways, it's in thinking about that contribution, in many ways, I want to sort of, I'm always sort of sitting with this aspect of what does it mean to sort of shake that up and sort of this and really even play further with this idea of what we talk about as new, right? Because first of all, I really struggle with that and really I always have a question of what does that mean to think about sort of the broader political problematics and saying something is new. But I think, but also when I talk about this idea of what it can do, what are these really powerful things that the possibility of sort of these ancestral engagements, right? And once again, I say that work is very much built upon so much of the scholarship of, Zora Neale Hurston, Ralph Ellison, but also Michelle Wright. Um, and once again like so many other people, right? So for me that it's about thinking about the contribution is really sort of also trying to maybe in a way pull these other senses, these other scholars in many ways that maybe we don't think of who as curriculum scholars. I mean, I very much think of them, right? It's I'm put that right there, but like for me, the contribution is in many ways thinking about like how do we begin to think about like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is very much a discussion, a broader discussion of research ethics, right? Or very much how we talk about how in many ways we can sort of really frame ways of talking about um, thinking about how we talk about new materialism and very much looking at somebody like a Zora Neale Hurston, right? And thinking about particular works like Their Eyes Were Watching God. Specifically when Zora writes, what does she write? She says, was it the rose of the world was it breathes out smell? It's like, oh my gosh, right? So it's many ways like all of these things. So it's not necessarily thinking about this island, right? But many for me is like the contribution is thinking about as many different sort of bridgings of modalities of knowledge that maybe we would have not necessarily thought of or went to immediately. But understanding like these senses of like the literature, thinking about, Black music, all these things as very much, as curriculum work, thinking of Sun Ra, thinking about what the ethics of that does, right? Thinking about June Tyson, all these people. I keep on going, sis.
Well, if you could tell us just one thing that you hope for the future of the field, what would it be?
um, how much longer? I mean, this is okay. This is the one thing that I'll say. Um, Maybe it will ruffle some feathers, but so be it. I'm not trying to be malicious or anything, but one of the things I really witnessed with the field that I struggle with is the narrowing of the field, right? I really want it to stay big, right? It's got to stay broad, right? I think in many ways, it's sort of how we even sort of think about the very fact you can't just go on sort of the surface of what it is, right? You can't just say curriculum immediately think about, oh, right, yeah, we're doing this, do this, lesson plans and everything. No, it's important that once again, it's like that ethos that once again built the field, right? Um, and looking at these casts that stayed so broad, right? Like once again, I gotta once again, it's always important to think about like OGs like Bill Dahl, right? Or Pinar, once again, right? But also think about the OGs like Cynthia Dillard as well, or Cameron McCarthy, right? Or Aoki, right? And part of the thing that's always, and I get so excited talking about these because I had or once again, Janet Miller, come on, right? Our dear sister, Janet Miller. Um, One of the things that always amazes me about, once again, in the past Um, Sitting with Bill Dahl, once again, the late Bill Dahl now, ancestor Dahl, is what shall I say? Was like they were always curious about ideas. They never have, they never did fall out of love with big ideas. They were always curious, right? I think it's that curiosity. And also, I add another one is I think also it's sort of um, a continuation of that generosity and that blessing. Right. That they are, but also thinking about what this field is. That's what I hope. That's what I hope. So once again, apologies. I went beyond one. I'll say two. So two, once again, to sort of really think about the sort of what I would call maybe even beyond sort of the philosophic. I would talk about sort of, I think also the spiritual aspect of it all, right? The spiritualism of that, which is very much framed in a sense of really staying in love with keeping in love with the big idea, but also a responsibility to sit with the big idea, right? Because one of the things that has always happened is you have these camps, right? In any field, right? And one of the things I'm always grow a little concerned of is where people say like, "Well, I'm in this camp," right? And I feel like what I've witnessed you, and I think sort of things that we've talked about aspirationally, is once again like what does it mean to sort of like be there and sort of be that leaf in the wind and really, really like flowing with not in sort of a nonlinear fashion of how we engage this rather than really associating yourself with a particular camp. So that and that's what I mean by the broadness too, right? We can be in these camps or whatever, but they can't be rigid. They can't have rigid boundaries, right? So once again, like melting. So and I see that happening a little bit. I see it happening a little too much, right? So yeah, that
Absolutely.
and just yeah, and just like once again the generosity, right? Because once
Yeah,
again, I always give a shout out, right? There was love and there was a deep generosity that was given to me by so many that was given to us and is still given to us by these people,
absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We're going to wrap it up. And as you all know, you can catch Dr. Mitchell's work online. I'll make sure that I post some of their work, that is to make it available to all. All right. Thank you very much.
All
Much love
right.
to you.
Peace, peace.